You are listening to continuing coverage of the trial of Chad Daybell from True Crime Today and the Hidden Killers podcast. Let's go back to the courtroom.
Now, as terms of, we talked about this previously as well, but the bruising alone does not lead you to asphyxiation. Is that right?
It does not.
Okay. And the facts about other activities that may have been occurring, particularly Brandon Boudreaux and Charles Vallow, don't lead to asphyxiation either, right?
No.
Now, previously last year, you testified, and there was some discussion about the 5 different levels of determination. Do you recall that?
I don't specifically know.
Or the 5 options. I'm sorry, the 5 options.
There are 5 manners of death, yes.
Right. And I'm sorry, I gave you the wrong term. I'm apologize. I wrote the word down the wrong way. The 5 determinations. And can you go over those with me again?
Sure.
Go ahead.
On a death certificate, there are essentially, in every state except New York and I think New Jersey, maybe Connecticut, there are 5 options for what the certifier of the death can list as the manner of death. Those are natural, accident, suicide, homicide, or undetermined, or could not be determined.
Okay. And I guess I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the undetermined one.
Okay.
And when you come up with an undetermined diagnosis, that means you don't have any reason that leads you to say this is absolutely the way this person passed away, correct?
Undetermined manner is used when you don't have enough circumstantial or investigative or autopsy findings, whatever. You don't have enough information to decide between 2 different manners. And that can be, for example, in an overdose, it could either be a suicide or it can be an accident. In this specific case, it could be, there's allegations of that her death is natural. If I believed it could be natural or it could be homicidal, then it could be undetermined because I can't really decide between those 2, but I did decide between those 2.
So that is a situation where if you don't have enough evidence to determine exactly why someone died, you make the determination of undetermined. Is that correct?
If you don't have enough, certainly if the cause of death is undetermined, then the manner of death will usually also be undetermined.
And that doesn't mean there was foul play. You just don't have the information to make that assessment. Would that be fair?
Yes.
So in other words, if in this situation there was insufficient evidence to determine a cause of death, it would be listed as undetermined, right?
The cause of death could be listed as undetermined, yes.
And at that point, that's a situation, like I said before, where it doesn't mean that it's homicide. It doesn't mean that there was foul play. You just don't have enough information to make that decision. Would that be fair?
It would be, yes, to an extent. It's possible that it doesn't mean that there's not foul play necessarily. Like if, for example, you call it undetermined because you think it might be a homicide or a suicide and you can't decide between the 2. Mm-hmm. If you call it undetermined because you can't necessarily decide between those 2, means you think it's just as likely that it was as it wasn't. I can't tell.
It could also
could be, but it might not be.
It could also be a situation where there's no medical information that leads you to any conclusion as to why someone passed away, right?
It could be.
Right. And there are situations where people pass away and there's no discernible reason why that happened. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. Now, you made mention of all the medical reports that you reviewed. Which medical reports did you review?
Reviewed records from Seasons Medical Clinic, from another clinic, whatever Seasons was before it was Seasons. I forget, it had a different name. She'd also been seen at a clinic in Utah before moving back to Idaho, and we'd looked at those as well.
And those were quite frankly, those were just a matter of a couple of pages, right?
Not a lot of records, no.
Right. Well, a couple of pages, right?
Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative, asked and answered. Counsel's testifying. Move to strike.
Well, it was late. It's already answered, so overruled.
Okay. And you looked at the Seasons Medical and you looked at the other medical records, and you were aware that 5 years prior to Tammy Daybell's death, she was diagnosed with anemia, right?
I believe so, yes.
And you didn't talk to the family about how that anemia had been progressing on Tammy Daybell. Is that right?
I did not.
Okay. And you were also aware that Tammy Daybell was taking a form of, and I don't want to, fluoxetine. Fluoxetine.
Mhm.
There's a reason I'm not a doctor. Fluoxetine, and that's a form of Prozac, right?
Yes. It's a generic.
And if fluoxetine is mixed with the wrong kind of other medicine, whether it's herbs or supplements or anything else, those can have significant consequences, correct?
There can be certainly drug interactions with herbal stuff. I'm not aware of any specific ones of fluoxetine with herbal remedies.
I'm sorry, Mr. Ramsey. And as part of your analysis and the testing for poisons and all of the other testing that you did, you're not really able to test for the herbals and the supplements and everything else and its interaction with fluoxetine to see if that had any impact, could you?
I think that's a two-part question. There's not really any way to test for drug interactions. You can test whether a drug is present or not, but certainly we don't have the ability to test for most herbal supplements.
Okay. And the fact that those herbal supplements, whether or not they could have an adverse impact with the fluoxetine that Tammy Daybell was taking, correct?
Don't have a way to determine that.
Right.
Whether they were even present.
The heavy lungs.
I'm sorry, the heavy what?
Heavy lungs.
Oh,
the heavy
yes.
lungs. That's an unusual medical malady. Would you agree?
It's a non-specific finding.
Okay. But it could have an impact on the cause of death here, correct?
It could, yes.
Right. And you didn't take that into consideration before you made your asphyxia determination, right?
No, absolutely we did.
No, you did?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You testified that asphyxia is really a diagnosis of exclusion, correct?
It is.
So in other words, you look at all other possibilities, and if you can't find anything else, you go to asphyxia. Would that be fair?
If you can't find anything else, more likely, yes.
Okay. Or what is if you can't find anything else? Why wouldn't you just go undetermined?
You might in some circumstances.
Okay. One of the things I want to ask you about are seizures.
Okay.
And when a person has a seizure, it's not always a result of there being some sort of physical evidence to support that, is there?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, there's a seizure can occur at any time. Any one of us could have a seizure at any time. Would you agree with that?
Could and is likely are very different things.
Okay. Okay. So are you at this point saying and excluding the fact that Tammy Daybell could have had a seizure as a possible cause of this death?
No, I can't 100% exclude it. I just think
Okay.
it's very unlikely.
You think it's unlikely? Okay.
Yes, very unlikely.
In spite of the fact that Chad Daybell talked about fainting and those types of issues, you're saying that because of that, it's very unlikely there could be a seizure, correct?
That's what I believe, yes.
Okay. And you're also saying, well, let me ask you this. A seizure can happen at any time unannounced, correct?
It can.
Okay. Or there could be some instances where there's some medical proof to support a seizure, correct?
You can have a seizure, yes, because you have a tumor or an infection or other things, or you have a condition that leads to a seizure, yes.
Okay. And then we talk a little bit about arrhythmia. And with arrhythmia, there isn't always an indication with arrhythmia that there's there isn't always a damaged heart or a faulty valve as a result of arrhythmia. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
In fact, arrhythmia could happen at any time. Any one of us with healthy hearts could suddenly have an arrhythmia and die, correct?
Very unlikely.
Very unlikely?
Yes, very
Okay.
unlikely.
Well, does that very unlikely change when you look at the fact that Tammy Daybell's family history had a history of heart issues? Does that change the very unlikely to likely?
Not in the context of what her heart looked like at autopsy.
Okay. And again, because her heart didn't look healthy or unhealthy, that isn't always the point, is it? Arrhythmia can occur even in the healthiest of hearts, correct?
Yes and no. Not in there is a reason that people have arrhythmias.
Okay.
It's not always apparent by looking at the heart. The heart certainly, as I discussed previously, can look normal, and you can have arrhythmias, but there will be something wrong with it, either microscopically evident or molecularly evident.
Okay. And molecularly evident means that there's some sort of syntax that hit the heart and it suddenly just stopped working properly, right?
It would just, yeah. An arrhythmia just means no rhythm. And if your heart stops beating, you have no rhythm.
Right. And if the heart for some reason stops beating and there's some sort of arrhythmia, suddenly we get the pink foam that starts developing in these heavy lungs, right?
You certainly can, yes.
Right. And if we get a seizure, and as a result of the seizure, the heart stops beating, and then these heavy lungs start accumulating the significant amount of pink foam we found in Tammy Daybell's body, correct?
It can happen that way, yes.
And if the anemia goes undiagnosed for 5 years and she's not getting treatment, and for some reason there's insufficient oxygen to reach these heavy lungs, we could get the same result, correct?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
Not given the activities that she was described as doing. She may have been anemic, but she was not anemic to the point it would cause those kinds of problems.
All right. In regards to a time of death, what I understood you were testifying to is there's really no definitive way to determine an accurate time of death. Would that be fair?
No way to determine a very specific time of death. A range, yes. A specific time, no.
Judge, I have nothing else. Thank you.
All right. Redirect.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Christensen, you were asked a lot about the exhumation order. Do you recall that?
I do.
You were not the one requesting that. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You were also asked about whether or not you spoke to Chad's kids, and you indicated no.
That's correct.
Did any of Chad's kids ever reach out to the office of the medical examiner?
They did not. To my knowledge. It's possible they might have, and I was not aware of it, but they didn't reach out and ask for me.
Did anyone ever pass on information that they'd reported to the office of the Utah Medical Examiner?
No.
So you reviewed documents you were provided from law enforcement, is that correct?
Yes.
And those documents contained statements provided by Chad Daybell?
They did.
There were no documents provided that had significant information from his kids, is that correct?
There were some about his kids, various interviews that have been conducted with their friends and things of that nature, but no, not from them directly, I don't believe.
So you wouldn't know if the kids ever agreed to speak with law enforcement, is that correct?
I do not know.
And if Chad's kids had made statements about Tammy's health, would those have been documents that you would have requested or wanted to review?
Absolutely.
So if they weren't provided to you, would you have any reason to think that those exist?
No.
And you were asked about Utah being a little different than Idaho's system. Do you recall that question?
Yes.
Would you describe them as a little different?
I guess Utah's and Idaho's death investigation systems are kind of on the opposite poles of the spectrum in the U.S.
And I think we talked about this, but Idaho, a coroner does not have to have any medical training, correct?
That's correct.
Whereas a forensic pathologist or medical examiner goes through years of schooling. They're a doctor.
Leading, sustained.
Your Honor, it's sustained on leading. Is that correct?
It's sustained.
Because I think it's within the scope.
It's not outside the scope, correct?
Just for my next question, I wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, I only sustained as it being leading.
I think we talked before, but you have worked in systems where a coroner is used, correct?
Yes.
And in your experience, do coroners have to have any medical training?
No.
And to be a forensic pathologist, again, what training do you go through?
Have to have a college degree, a medical degree, and residency training in pathology, and then forensic fellowship training.
And in Utah, again, who is it that would determine if an autopsy is to be completed?
It would be done by the Office of the Medical Examiner.
So one of the individuals that has all that medical training?
Either by them or one of our investigators. And if there are questions, then they ask us.
You were asked about the 5 different, I believe, manners that can be indicated.
That's correct.
Is it common practice for the Office of the Utah Medical Examiner to look at the surrounding facts in addition to what's concluded from the autopsy?
Yes.
And I think you talked about an example of a drug overdose, that there could be several manners, even if that's the cause.
Yes.
And you were asked about a history of anemia. Can you explain what anemia is?
Anemia is when your blood count, the percentage of your blood that's made up of red blood cells, drops below normal levels. Men have a slightly higher normal range than women, but they're both in the 35 to 50% range, more or less. That percentage of your blood is made up of red blood cells that carry oxygen around your body. You can develop anemia, which is a number lower than that for a variety of reasons. It can happen from vitamin deficiencies, can happen from iron deficiency, can happen from cancers, anything that infiltrates your bone marrow. Can happen because you bleed. It's not uncommon in young women with heavy periods and things, for example, to end up being anemic because of blood loss. But it can be from traumatic blood loss as well. You can be acutely anemic because you got your arm broken and torn open in a car crash or something. All of those things can lead to anemia, but generally speaking, a progressive slow type of anemia, whether it's vitamin deficiency or something like that, is something that your body is able to compensate for to some extent, that you remain functional, though you might be fatigued or other things of that nature. But it's not, you don't have normal oxygen carrying capacity. And so if you went from living at sea level to the mountains, you might notice more of a difference than if you weren't anemic, things of that nature.
Sustained.
Is anemia treatable?
Yes, most times.
And I think you indicated you'd seen a history of Tammy having anemia maybe 5 years before her death.
I believe that's when it was documented, yes.
And if there were no other indications of anemia in her medical records, could that indicate that it was treated?
Overruled.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. We're not seeing any additional notations in medical records about anemia other than the past history. Could that indicate that the anemia was treated? And Your Honor, if I may respond.
Go ahead.
Dr. Christensen's testimony was he saw a notation of it from 5 years previous to that, and Mr. Pryor went into it on his cross-examination.
No, I'm going to rule on that. It's overruled, Mr. Pryor. You can continue.
Could that indicate that the anemia was treated?
It could. It just means that it certainly was not mentioned again as a problem.
In looking at those medical records, do you recall seeing any indication that Tammy had low blood pressure?
Her blood pressure was on the lowish side of normal, but no indication that she had a diagnosis of hypotension or low blood pressure.
Could you use the microphone, please, Mr. Pryor?
Foundation judge, I'd like to know what report he's referencing where he saw that information.
And Your Honor, my question was just about the medical records that he reviewed in general.
All right, then he should be able to specify which medical record she's talking
Mr.
about, Judge.
Pryor, this is not an objection. It's just an argument now. Is there an objection?
There is, Foundation.
All right. The objection is overruled.
In the medical reports you reviewed, you didn't see any sign of low blood pressure.
I did not.
In the medical records you reviewed, did you see any signs of seizures?
No.
In the medical reports you reviewed, did you see any indication that Tammy had had a prior history of any negative drug interactions between her prescription medication and herbal remedies?
No.
And counsel asked you about the bruises on Tammy and them being labeled as not specific. Do you
Yes.
recall that?
Yes.
You indicated that sometimes you are able to form an opinion as to how those may have been inflicted. Is that correct?
I can answer hypotheticals about how they may have been inflicted, yes.
And based on your training and experience, where those bruises were located, could they be consistent with someone being restrained?
They could be, yes.
And you were asked a lot about those pictures and if someone was holding Tammy down and then suffocating her. Do you recall that line of questioning?
Yes. Yes.
Where the bruises were located, would it be possible for someone to have been restraining her while someone else suffocated her?
It's possible.
Based on your experience and and the autopsy and your review of documents, in your opinion, is it likely that Tammy died of a seizure?
No.
Based on your training, experience, review of the records and autopsy, is it likely that Tammy Daybell died of a cardiac arrhythmia?
No.
Based on your experience, review of the documents and autopsy, is it likely Tammy Daybell died of a drug overdose or drug interaction?
No.
Based on your experience, training, review of reports on the autopsy, is it your opinion Tammy most likely or likely died of asphyxiation?
Yes.
And again, what did you determine the cause of death to be?
Asphyxia.
And what did you determine the manner of death to be?
Homicide.
I have no further questions.
All right. Thank you. That did not go beyond the scope of cross.
Judge, can we have a sidebar?
Yes. All right, counsel, after sidebar, the court's determined I'll allow a recross on that one narrow scope of the issue you want to discuss, Mr. Pryor, with the witness.
So, doctor, we talked about two types of medical records. One was from Seasons. I believe that was 2017. You recall that?
There was a record from 2017, yes.
And then there was a medical record from 2019. Is that right?
There was. Mhm.
Okay. And those were the two records that you had in terms of Tammy Daybell's medical records, correct?
No. There were also records from PA Senna that she saw at Seasons. There was a record from 2016 as well as one from 2015.
Okay. And the anemia diagnosis was from what year?
I believe 2014, which was, I don't recall specifically which records that was in. We also had records from a clinic in Springville.
Okay. Is it possible that the anemia was from the Seasons records of 2017?
Possible. I don't recall for sure.
Okay. So from 2017, we have one other medical record where she went in for a wrist issue, correct?
Correct.
So how do you determine whether or not she's treated for anemia if there are no other medical records other than the initial diagnosis from 2017?
Objection, Your Honor, misstates the testimony.
Overruled.
There's no mention of treatment either way.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, that will conclude then the testimony. Dr. Christensen, is the state intending to recall him at some point or any point, Ms. Blake?
We may be, Your Honor.
Okay. Dr. Christensen, then, because you may return to testify at a later time, the court's exclusionary rule prohibits you from viewing trial testimony. I'll be asking you if you have viewed any of the testimony after
Counsel,
you step down today. So with that, that will conclude the testimony of Dr. Christensen. You may go ahead.
Judge, before he's excused, could we have another sidebar?
All right. All right. After the sidebar, counsel for the defense has correctly pointed out, and I agree that expert witnesses are not subject to the same exclusionary rules that normal lay witnesses are. So the state will discuss that further with you, Dr. Christensen, and you may in fact be entitled to view certain parts of this trial as they would be outside of the exclusionary rules. So you'll be further advised of that by the prosecutors if they wish to clarify that with you. Thank you again for appearing to testify, and we'll go ahead and let you step down at this time. All right, is the state prepared to call its next witness?
Yes, Your Honor. The state will call Alice Gilbert.
All right.
Swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Yes.
Got her.
Try to speak directly to them.
All right, I'll note that Ms. Gilbert's now been placed under oath. Before we begin with testimony, I just want to inquire, have you watched any of this trial on either the live stream or here in person at all?
No,
Okay, have you talked to anybody else about any testimony they've given in trial?
no.
Okay, thank you for letting the court know that. Ms. Blake, you can inquire on direct.
Thank you, Your Honor. Would you please state your name and spell it for the record?
Alice Gilbert, ALICEGILBERT.
And Miss Gilbert, do you know an individual named Chad Daybell?
I do.
How do you know him?
He was my neighbor, and when we moved into the neighborhood, we got to know him through our community and our ward.
Did you also know Tammy or Tamara Daybell?
I do.
And did you know her the same way?
Yes.
And what did you refer to her as, Tammy or Tamara?
I called her Tammy.
And when you moved into the neighborhood, do you recall approximately when that would have been?
It was March of 2017.
And were the Daybells already living there?
Yes.
Did you get to know Tammy or Chad? Did you get to know one of them better than the other one?
Tammy. I got to know Tammy better.
And how did you end up getting to know Tammy?
We worked in the same church calling together. And so I got to know her through that church calling.
And when you say church calling, what church is that associated with?
The LDS church.
And what callings did the two of you hold where you worked closely?
I was the Relief Society president, and she was my first counselor.
How often do you think you saw Tammy?
We met once a week and on Sundays.
And did that seeing each other twice a week continue for an extended period of time?
until her death.
And do you recall when the two of you were given the callings?
October of 2018.
So for about a year, you would see Tammy about twice a week.
Yes.
Did you get to know Tammy pretty well?
I thought so. I thought we did.
And can you describe Tammy a little bit, your relationship with her? Let me back up. Can you describe a little bit about what Tammy was like?
Yes. She was great to work with. She was organized when we had our meetings. She could worked on the computer. So when we had to change anything, she could do it in a flash. She did all the computer work. When we organized activities, we valued her opinion and was grateful to have her input on things. And she would say, keep it simple, keep our activities simple. And we did, and that helped a lot. She had a lot of empathy for some of the women who were struggling in the ward, and she would relate those things to us in our meetings. She also had a very good wit with her.
Did you have occasions to observe Chad and Tammy together?
I did, mostly at church, and they seemed great at church. You know, it was just normal. It was, and we had activities. He did come and help set up some chairs for activities. And so that seemed normal. And I really didn't think much of it.
At some point in time, did you feel like their interactions changed?
A little bit, yes. In 2019, it just seemed distant. It just seemed a bit distant between the two. But I just noticed them at church.
Did Tammy ever talk to you about her marriage?
She didn't. I think the only thing she did mention was that sometimes the finances were a little strained, but she didn't mention anything else.
When you observed Tammy, did you ever notice her appear to slow down?
No.
Did you ever notice any change in her activity level prior to her death?
No.
Did she ever complain to you about any health issues?
No.
Did you ever observe Tammy have any shaking fits?
No.
Did you ever observe Tammy faint?
No.
How did you learn about Tammy's death?
On the morning of the 19th, I received a phone call from Emma, and she was...
Objection, Judge. This is going to call for some hearsay.
It's eliciting hearsay on that part, so that's sustained.
And just to clarify, when you say on the 19th, is that October 19th of 2019?
Yes.
And you indicated that Emma had phoned you. How did Emma seem when you talked to her?
She was sobbing.
And after that, based on that phone call, without saying what Emma said, did you learn anything in relation to Tammy?
That she had passed away.
Objection, Judge. Calls for hearsay.
Sustained.
At some point, did someone else take the phone?
Chad, he took the phone.
And what did Chad tell you?
He asked me not to tell anybody for about an hour that she had passed away. And I said, well, I need to tell the bishop. And he said, no, don't tell the bishop. And I knew that the bishop was going to work. And so I called him anyway and informed him.
And what you called to inform him was of Tammy's death?
Yes.
Were you surprised to hear of her passing?
Yes.
And why were you surprised?
I had just talked to her on Wednesday and she was fine. She was excited. She had just gotten a new grandbaby. We had talked about Mark and his mission, and she had told us experiences of his mission, and she was excited with things.
On October 19th, after learning of her death, at some point, did you end up going to the Daybell residence?
Yes. My husband and I went over at about 8:30 in the morning, and Chad answered the door and he gave us a hug. And we went in, and all the children, except for Mark and their spouses, were sitting there in the living room. They were stunned. The children were stunned. They could hardly speak. and crying.
Did you end up making any observations of Chad when you arrived?
Yes, when I asked him what happened, and he said that Tammy vomited at midnight, and they think she passed away at 2 a.m., and that her legs were hanging over the bed and that she'd fallen out of bed. He also said they think, did I say this? That they think she died of an embolism.
And Chad provided all this information the morning of her death?
Yes.
How did Chad appear to you?
He wasn't as upset as the children. He had was ready to tell us, and he wasn't as devastated as the children were.
And you indicated you'd just seen her the Wednesday before her death.
Yeah.
Did she complain to you at all that day of any health issues?
No. And I knew she was taking clogging lessons when we would have activity nights.
Judge, I'm going to object at this point, just going into a narrative.
World.
You can answer.
I can answer. We had activity nights, which started at, I think, 6:30. She would leave early, maybe 8 o'clock, because she was going to a clogging class. And so in my mind, I'm thinking I'm going home to bed at 8 o'clock. She was going to a clogging class. So I admired her for doing that.
On Wednesday, when you saw her, did Tammy have a cough that you noticed?
No,
Did she have any kind of a coughing fit around that time?
I didn't notice any.
After arriving at the Daybell residence, did you do something else that morning?
Yes. We had asked if they had breakfast, and they hadn't. So my husband and I said, well, we'll go get you breakfast. And as we stood up to go, Chad told us that her funeral was going to be on Tuesday and a memorial on Wednesday. And I was surprised. And I said, well, did you plan this? And he said, no, but I was surprised that fast that he could tell me that.
And when you ask if he planned it, why did you ask that?
Because I know what it takes to plan a funeral with a ward and to organize the church and have the ladies in the ward provide the meal. And you need to ask the sisters to volunteer to provide meals. And it takes time. All of it takes time. So I was really surprised. But then he said her funeral was in Springville. That also surprised me because we were there in Idaho.
And do you recall what day of the week October 19th was?
Saturday.
And the funeral was going to be on
Tuesday.
And did Chad respond when you asked if he had already planned the funeral or if he and Tammy had talked about it before?
He said no, but I felt like it had been planned.
Did you end up attending the funeral?
Yes. I needed to see her. So my husband and I went to the funeral in Springfield. And I needed to see her in the casket. And she looked nice in the casket.
Did you ever talk to Chad about why he held the funeral in Springville?
I didn't. I just assumed it was because they lived there before. So I didn't ask.
When you were at the funeral, do you recall making any observations of Chad?
When we viewed her before the funeral, and it was just him standing by the casket. It didn't seem really mournful with him. I said, oh, she looks good. And he said, yes, she does. And we didn't cry. We didn't, it didn't seem mournful. And then we went into the chapel to sit for the funeral. And I sat by, and our bishop had driven down, so we sat with him.
During the funeral, do you recall if Chad spoke?
Yes, all the children spoke, and he spoke last. I was impressed with the children's talks. that fast. They did a nice job to their mother. I was surprised because it takes a day to drive. So to go funeral on Tuesday, they would have driven Monday. They did the children did a nice job. And Chad spoke last. I was surprised because most spouses are too devastated to speak. And so I was surprised that he spoke at her funeral, and it was last. And it was like a church talk. The other talks were more loving tributes to their mother. His was more church talk.
And do you recall if there was a memorial service held?
It was held the next day in Idaho, but I did not attend because I had just been to her funeral.
Did you end up having a role or playing a part in taking a meal to Chad's family?
Yes. So our presidency and the bishopric provided a meal for them after the memorial. And so we took it over to them after, and we had put it down for them to eat, and the kids had started to eat. And Chad told us that he was moving out, that he couldn't be there, and that he was going to move to Rexburg to a condo. And we asked him, like, do you need help or anything? He said no, that his friend had a condo for him, that he wasn't there very often, so that he told him he could stay there.
And you said do you recall, did Chad refer to the friend as a he?
In I took it as that, and I'm thinking he said because he said he wasn't there very often, and so he could stay there.
So Tammy's pronounced dead on Saturday, correct? And by the following Wednesday, Chad's got plans to move out of the house.
Yes.
Do you recall anything else that morning standing out to you as far as what Chad told his kids?
He had told his kids to go through Tammy's things after he told us he was moving out, and that surprised me too. That's maybe I'm more sentimental, but it just seemed fast. And they kind of took it in stride, and I think they did do that.
In the time just after Tammy's death, did you have an opportunity to observe any of the Daybell children? So Chad and Tammy's children.
I went and saw Emma on Friday, and she was sobbing. She's really struggling, and she was getting really sick. She lost a lot of weight. We had organized meals for her. I know the school district was taking meals into her and Garth. She was struggling. She told me she missed
Judge,
her mother.
objection,
Grounds?
hearsay.
Sustained.
Did Emma appear to be struggling to you?
Yes.
Did Garth appear to be struggling as well?
Yes.
And on Friday, to the best of your knowledge, had Chad moved out of the residence?
Yes. I think he moved after the memorial.
So you visited with Garth and Emma just less than a week after their mother's
On Friday.
passing.
Yeah.
Was Chad there when you went to visit him?
No.
And when you say the house you went to, what house was Emma staying in at that time? Do you recall?
Yeah, she lived Keeney cornered from Chad's house.
And do you know what house Garth was staying in?
And Garth was living in Chad's house.
At some point, did you end up reaching out to Chad?
Yeah, so we thought we would call and see how he was doing. And I think it was Saturday, the 26th of October. We called him to see if we could come and visit with him. And he said no, that he would come to our place. So he came on the 26th. He came over to our place. I think it was more toward the evening when he came.
And Judge, for foundation purposes, that would have been the month of what and year?
Like, do you want to clarify when that happened, please?
When you talk about the 26th, are we still in October of 2019?
Yes.
So just shortly after Tammy's passing.
Yes.
And Chad indicated to you he didn't want you to come to his place, but he'd come to yours.
Yeah. He he said, "Oh, I'll come over to your place." So we said, "Okay."
Did you ever end up seeing where Chad was living in Rexburg?
No,
And did he in fact end up coming to your place?
he did.
And did you end up having a conversation with him at that time?
Yes. He sat at our kitchen table, and I had made cookies and thought that, we would make it nice. And he said that he'd found the woman he was going to marry. And we were absolutely stunned when he said that. And we asked him, "Well, where did you meet her?" And he said, "At the conference in St. George in 2018. And we asked who she was, and he wasn't going to tell us at first. And then he said, "Well, I'll tell you. Her name is Lori Vallow."
Had you heard the name Lori Vallow before then?
I hadn't. I was thinking, who is Lori Vallow? And then he mentioned that she had done a podcast with Melanie Gibb. And then I realized that's who that was.
Had you ever met Melanie Gibb in person?
Not then. I hadn't met her in person.
And you'd never met Lori Vallow at that point?
No.
And to the best of your recollection, this was around October 26th.
Yes.
So just 7 days after Tammy's passed away.
Yeah.
Were you surprised to hear that Chad had already found someone else to marry?
Absolutely.
At some point, did you end up meeting Lori Vallow?
Yes. While he was at our home, he said that she was in town. Would we like to meet her? We said yes. Tuesday nights, my husband and I had gone to the temple. So we were in the temple on Tuesday nights. We were waiting in a room for a meeting to begin that following Tuesday. And he tapped us on the shoulder and had us step out in the hallway. And that's where we met Lori and her niece, Melanie, and a friend. I cannot remember her name.
And that was your first time meeting Lori?
Yes.
And it was at the temple?
It was at the temple.
And Judge, could we have some foundation as to the date, time?
Your Honor, that's already been discussed.
I must have missed it, Judge.
Go ahead, Ms. Blake.
Ms. Gilbert, at some point after that, did Chad and Lori end up coming to your house?
Yes. And it was in that week, and I think it was Friday from that Tuesday that he came over with her. And it was cold when they came in. I asked her if she was getting used to the cold, and she said she'd bought some warm clothes. And they sat on the couch, and it was awkward.
And when you say it was awkward, did you make observations of Chad and Lori's interactions?
Yes, they were very affectionate with each other, more than I had ever seen Chad. It was very affectionate with her, and they were giggling and laughing, and my husband and I were embarrassed.
Had you ever seen Chad act that way with Tammy?
No.
Did you end up talking at that time to Lori about her family?
I did. I asked her if she'd been married, and she said yes, that her husband had died in December of a heart attack. I asked her if she had children, and then Chad said that she had recently had a daughter that had passed. And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry." And I said, "How many?" And she said, "Thank you." And I said, "How many children do you have?" And she kind of stammered and said they were stepchildren, and I did not get a definite answer on that.
When Chad said that she'd recently lost a daughter, did Lori say anything to correct that or change it?
No.
And this would have occurred end of October, beginning of November of 2019. Is that correct?
Yes.
You also talked about, you asked Lori if she was getting used to the cold. Do you recall anything about that particular October?
Yes, it was a very cold October. It was an early frost and a hard frost. So the farmers were getting their potatoes early. I used to work for an ag company, and so the importance of the potatoes not freezing. And not only that, they were helping each other to get their crops out early. So it was a cold October.
When Chad and Lori were there, did they talk to you and your husband about plans for a future together?
Yes, they had talked about getting married, but they didn't know when or where yet. They planned on taking the kids to Disneyland at Thanksgiving time.
And did Chad tell you anything about his plans to write a book?
Yes, he told us he was going to Hawaii to write a book, but I didn't know they were going to live there. He just said he was planning on writing a book and going to Hawaii.
So Chad mentioned he was going to be going to Hawaii, correct?
Yes.
And he and Lori also mentioned their plans to get married to you.
Judge, there's been some leading here.
Sustained.
And this took place in end of October, beginning of November 2019.
Yes.
When they talked about taking the kids to Disneyland, do you know which kids they were referencing?
It was Chad's children.
Did they ever mention taking any of Lori's children with them?
No, I had the impression that she was an empty nester, and I assumed the daughter was older, that had passed, from a disease or cancer or something, but I assumed she didn't have any other children.
Did Chad or Lori provide you any details as to how Lori's daughter died?
No, and I did not ask.
And Your Honor, I'm just looking at the time, and now may be a good time to take a break in testimony for the lunch hour.
Okay, I appreciate that, Ms. Blake. We will go ahead and take the noon lunch hour. We'll take the hour and be back on for additional testimony at 1:00.
All right, please.
There's more to come in the trial of Chad Daybell. Press subscribe so you don't miss any of our continuing coverage right here from True Crime Today and the Hidden Killers podcast.